The scent of pine and cinnamon was the first thing that greeted you at Arthur and Mary's house on Christmas Eve. It was a fragrance that Eleanor had associated with warmth, with safety, and with love for all her 47 years. It was the smell of home. This year, however, a faint, almost unnoticeable undertone of anxiety seemed to cling to the festive air, a scent only she seemed to be able to detect. She stood by the fireplace, adjusting a small, hand-carved wooden ornament on a drooping pine branch. It was a little bird, its wings outstretched, carved from a piece of driftwood she'd found on a beach that summer. It had taken her weeks to get it right, sanding the wood until it was as smooth as a river stone, carefully painting its tiny eye with the tip of a needle. It was a gift for her father, Arthur, a man who had taught her that the value of a thing was measured in the love poured into it, not the price tag attached. Her hands, though, were the real story. They were never still. They were the hands of a creator. Over the years, they had learned to knit, to paint, to carve, to sculpt. While others saw hobbies, Eleanor saw a language. It was how she expressed the things her voice could not. In a world that was growing louder, faster, and more disposable, her handmade gifts were her quiet rebellion, a testament to patience and affection. This year, more than ever, they felt like the only true thing she had to offer. Her sister Sarah bustled past, her face flushed with the stress of hosting. "Ellie, can you check on the roast? Richard is getting, well, you know how he gets when he's hungry." She gave a weak smile, but her eyes were tired. It had been a hard year for Sarah and Richard. Richard's business venture had stumbled, a fact he compensated for by clinging ever more tightly to the appearance of wealth. He wore his designer watch like a shield and spoke of stock markets and investments as if they were ancient philosophies. Eleanor gave her sister's arm a gentle squeeze. "Of course. Don't you worry about a thing." As she walked toward the kitchen, she saw him, Richard, holding court by the grand Christmas tree, which was laden with gleaming, store-bought baubles that glittered under the lights. He was laughing, a loud, booming sound that demanded attention, holding up his new phone for everyone to admire. "Latest model," he announced to anyone who would listen. "The camera on this thing is unbelievable. You wouldn't believe the clarity." Eleanor's nephew, a boy of 16, looked on with wide, envious eyes. Her own son, David, however, sat quietly on the sofa, reading a book, blissfully immune to his uncle's performance. David understood. He had grown up watching his mother turn scraps of fabric into quilts and simple blocks of wood into art. He knew where the real magic lay. Later, as they gathered around the dining table, the conversation inevitably turned to gifts. Richard dominated the topic, detailing the expensive perfume he had bought for Sarah, the drone he had secured for his son, the cashmere sweater he expected to unwrap. "It's about quality," he declared, gesturing with his fork. "Investing in things that last. You get what you pay for, after all." Eleanor felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was a profound sadness. He saw the world through such a narrow lens, a window that only looked out onto price tags and brand names. He couldn't see the landscape of effort, of time, of love that stretched out beyond it. Her gifts were all nestled under the tree, wrapped in simple brown paper and tied with twine. A hand-knitted scarf for Sarah, in the exact shade of blue that matched her eyes. The carved bird for her father. A jar of her prize-winning strawberry jam for her mother, Mary. For Richard. For him, she had labored over the most challenging project of all, a beautifully bound, hand-stitched photo album, filled with pictures from the past year. Pictures of moments he had been too busy to notice. Arthur teaching his grandson how to fish, Mary reading a story to the children, Sarah laughing in the garden, her face free from worry for a fleeting moment. It was a collection of priceless moments, a reminder of the wealth they already possessed. She knew, with a sinking feeling, that he wouldn't understand it. He would see paper and cardboard. He would see a lack of expense. He wouldn't see the hours she'd spent carefully curating the photos, the love that had guided her hand as she stitched the binding. But she had to try, because this year, of all years, the family needed to remember what was real. They needed to remember that the greatest gifts couldn't be bought. They had to be lived. And some, she thought with a private, heavy heart, had to be saved. The ritual of gift-giving began after dinner, as it always did. Arthur, acting as the unofficial master of ceremonies, would pick a present from under the tree, read the tag aloud in his warm, rumbling voice, and deliver it to its recipient. The room was filled with the sounds of tearing paper and polite murmurs of gratitude. Richard's expensive offerings were opened with a certain performative awe. Sarah's perfume, David's drone, his own father's cashmere sweater. Each was met with Richard's satisfied nod, as if he were single-handedly keeping the spirit of Christmas capitalism alive. When her father unwrapped the small wooden bird, he fell silent. He turned the delicate object over and over in his large, weathered hands, his thumb stroking the smooth, curved wings. A genuine smile, the kind that reached deep into his eyes, spread across his face. "Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's beautiful. It looks just like the little finches that visit the garden." He didn't need to say more. In his quiet appreciation, Eleanor felt seen. Her mother was equally touched by her jam, holding the jar to the light. "Oh, my prize-winning daughter. We'll have this on toast tomorrow morning. A real treat." Sarah, too, loved her scarf. She wrapped it around her neck immediately, the deep blue making her tired eyes seem a little brighter. "It's perfect, Ellie, thank you." She shot a nervous glance at her husband, who was watching the scene with a smirk, a look of condescending amusement on his face. He hadn't yet received his gift from Eleanor, and she could feel his judgment coiling in the air, waiting to strike. Finally, it was his turn. Arthur handed him the last present wrapped in brown paper. "This one's for you, Richard." From Eleanor. Richard took it with a sigh of theatrical reluctance, as if the very act of accepting it was a burden. He tore the paper off impatiently, revealing the hand-stitched album. He stared at it for a long moment, his brow furrowed. He flipped open the cover, his eyes scanning the first few pages without a flicker of recognition. He saw photos of his own son, his wife, her parents, but he didn't seem to register the moments themselves. He only saw paper. He closed the album with a quiet thud and placed it on the floor beside his chair, as one might set aside a coaster. Then he looked up, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Well, Ellie," he began, his voice dripping with false sincerity, "you certainly tried." The room went still. The crackling of the fire in the hearth suddenly seemed deafening. "Every year," he continued, leaning forward and addressing the room as if it were a boardroom, "it's the same thing. Little arts and crafts projects, quaint, sentimental." He picked up the cashmere sweater his son had given him. "But let's be honest. What does this?" He gestured dismissively toward the album on the floor. "Actually do? What value does it have? A real gift is something of substance, something that shows you've worked hard, that you've succeeded. It's a measure of your ability to provide." He looked directly at Eleanor, his eyes cold and sharp. "He mocked my homemade gifts at Christmas," he said, a strange, triumphant glint in his eye as if quoting an imaginary, pathetic headline about her. "It's a sweet gesture, I suppose. But this family, this house, this entire holiday, it doesn't run on gestures, it runs on money, on hard work. It runs on people like me who understand that you can't pay a mortgage with a jar of jam or a knitted scarf." The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Sarah's face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. Arthur looked as if he'd been struck, his jaw tight with a fury he rarely showed. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Every word was a carefully aimed dart, and they had all found their mark. It wasn't just an insult to her gift. It was an insult to her life, to her values, to the very way she loved her family. She could feel the sting of tears behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give him the satisfaction. Her son, David, had put his book down and was staring at his uncle with a look of pure contempt. He made a move to stand up, to speak, but Eleanor gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Not now. The pain was a physical thing, a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. He had taken something pure, her love, her effort, and twisted it into a symbol of inadequacy in front of everyone she cared for. He had held up his world of price tags and profit margins and declared it the only one that mattered, and in doing so, had made her feel utterly, hopelessly small. The silence in the room stretched, thin and fragile, threatening to snap. It was a silence filled with unspoken words. Shame from Sarah, who stared down at her plate as if it held the secrets to the universe. Indignation from Arthur, whose knuckles were white where he gripped the arm of his chair. And a chilling, self-satisfied smugness from Richard, who leaned back, confident in his victory. He believed he had delivered the final word on value, a knockout punch in a debate only he was having. Eleanor let the silence hang for a moment longer. She looked around the room, not as a victim, but as an observer. She saw the familiar cracks in the family's facade that she had spent years trying to patch with her quiet acts of love. She saw the worry etched around her sister's eyes, a constant companion for the past year. She saw the proud set of her father's jaw, a man who had worked with his hands his entire life and was now being told that such labor had no real worth. And she saw Richard posturing in his cashmere sweater, a man so terrified of appearing weak that he had to tear others down to feel tall. In that moment, something shifted inside Eleanor. The initial sting of his words began to recede, replaced by a strange, cold clarity. The hurt was still there, a dull ache in her chest, but it was now overshadowed by a powerful, resolute calm. This was no longer about a handmade photo album. It was about the very foundation of their family, about the invisible burdens they all carried. His cruelty had inadvertently given her a permission she never would have sought for herself, the permission to speak the truth. Her son, David, caught her eye from across the room. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent message of support that fortified her more than any words could have. Slowly, Eleanor placed her napkin on the table and rose to her feet. Her movement was deliberate, unhurried. It was not the posture of someone defeated. Every eye in the room lifted to watch her. The fire crackled, seeming to hold its breath. She did not look at Richard at first. Instead, she looked at her sister, Sarah. "You're right, Richard," she said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. It was steady, devoid of tremor or malice. The unexpected agreement caught him off guard, his smug expression faltering for a second. "You are absolutely right," Eleanor repeated, now letting her gaze drift to him. "This family, this house, it doesn't run on gestures. It doesn't run on sentiment. It runs on hard work. It runs on sacrifice. And you are right that you cannot pay a mortgage with a jar of jam." Sarah looked up at her, a panicked expression on her face. "Ellie, please, let's not—" Eleanor held up a hand, a gesture of gentle authority. "It's all right, Sarah. He's opened the conversation. I think it's time we finished it." She turned her full attention back to her brother-in-law. "You talk about providing, about substance, about the value of money. You hold it up as the ultimate measure of a person's worth, and I understand why. It's tangible. You can count it. It feels real. It makes you feel secure, powerful. There is nothing wrong with that." She paused, letting her words settle. She could see the confusion on his face. This was not the tearful, defensive reaction he had expected. He had prepared for a fight or a retreat, not this calm, surgical dissection of his philosophy. "But you see," Eleanor continued, her voice gaining a quiet strength, "there are different kinds of providing. There is the kind that you announce to the world, the kind that comes with a new watch or a new phone. And then there is the kind that happens in silence, the kind that asks for nothing in return, the kind that steps in when the loud, performative providing fails." The last word hung in the air, sharp and pointed. Richard's face paled slightly. He knew. Of course he knew. He just never imagined anyone else did. He certainly never imagined Eleanor, the quiet crafter of useless gifts, would be the one to say it out loud. Eleanor looked around at her family, her heart aching for the pain this revelation would cause, but knowing it was necessary. The wound had been opened, and it needed to be cleaned. "It has been a hard year," she said softly, her gaze resting on her parents, then on her sister. "A very hard year. We've all felt it, haven't we? The worry, the uncertainty, the fear of losing what we've all worked so hard to build." She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what came next. "So when you ask what value my little arts and crafts projects have, I will tell you." Then I told them who paid the mortgage this year. The words dropped into the stunned silence of the room like stones into a still pond. Then I told them who paid the mortgage this year. It wasn't a boast. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the quiet weight of a truth that had been held for too long. Richard stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, sickly pallor. He shook his head slowly, a gesture of pure disbelief. "What? What are you talking about? That's ridiculous. That's impossible." "Is it?" Eleanor asked, her voice still gentle. She didn't need to raise it. The power was not in the volume, but in the substance of her words. "You see, Richard, while you were talking about the market and admiring your new phone, I was working. My little arts and crafts projects, as you call them, turned into something more." She looked at her hands, the hands he had indirectly mocked. "A few years ago, after David started college and the house felt too quiet, I started selling some of my pieces online. Just a few at first. A carved bird here, a knitted blanket there. It wasn't for the money, not really. It was to feel connected, to feel useful." She paused, looking around the room at her family, who were now listening with rapt attention. "But people liked what I made. They liked that it was real, that it was made with care. The little online shop grew. I started getting custom orders. Museums, believe it or not, started asking for replicas of historical textiles. Collectors wanted my carvings. It turns out that in a world full of things that are mass-produced, a little piece of something real has value. The word value hung in the air, a direct echo of his own arrogant speech. When Sarah told me in confidence how bad things had gotten, Eleanor continued, her gaze now softening as she looked at her sister. When she told me the bank had sent the first notice, I knew I couldn't just stand by and offer sympathies. Sympathy doesn't keep a roof over your head. So, I went to the bank. I spoke to them about restructuring the loan, and for the past 6 months I have been making the payments, all of them. From my savings, the savings from my quaint, sentimental work. Sarah finally broke, her face crumpling as she let out a choked sob. She covered her face with her hands, not out of shame for being exposed, but from the overwhelming weight of her sister's silent sacrifice. Arthur reached over and placed a hand on his daughter's back, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears as he looked at Eleanor with a fierce, profound pride. Richard finally found his voice, though it was thin and reedy, a pale imitation of his earlier booming confidence. You're lying. Sarah, she would have told me. Why would I? Sarah whispered from behind her hands, her voice muffled. So you could feel like even more of a failure? So your pride could get in the way and you'd refuse? I knew you couldn't handle the truth, Richard. I just didn't realize she was the one protecting us both. Eleanor took a step closer to the table, her earlier calm now tinged with a deep, sorrowful empathy. I never wanted you to know, Richard. This was never meant to be a weapon. I did it because I love my sister. I did it because this is my family and this is my parents' home, the home they built. I did it because that's what family does. We don't keep score. We don't announce our contributions. We just show up. We fill the gaps. Silently, without needing a round of applause. She bent down and picked up the photo album from the floor where he had discarded it. She held it out, not to him, but just holding it in her hands. This, she said, her voice dropping to an almost whisper, was meant to be a reminder of that. A reminder of the real wealth we have. The moments, the connections, the quiet, unspoken support. That's the substance. That's the value. I am so sorry that you can't see it. He couldn't look at her. He couldn't look at anyone. He stared at the polished wood of the dining table, his reflection staring back at him, a stranger in a cashmere sweater. The entire architecture of his self-worth, a structure he had built with bravado and brand names, had been demolished in a matter of minutes by a quiet truth spoken with love. The man who had mocked the gift giver had just been revealed as the one who had received the greatest gift of all, and he had been utterly blind to it. The room remained a tableau of suspended emotion. No one moved. No one spoke. Richard sat frozen, a man trapped in the wreckage of his own making. The silence was no longer angry or awkward. It was heavy with the weight of a profound, painful truth. It was the sound of a worldview collapsing. It was Mary, the family's gentle matriarch, who finally broke the spell. She rose slowly from her chair and walked around the table, her footsteps soft on the wooden floor. She didn't go to Richard. Instead, she went to Eleanor and wrapped her arms around her. "Oh, my child," she whispered, her voice thick with a mother's love and sorrow. "Your father and I, we are so proud of the woman you are. Your strength has always been the quietest, but the deepest." Then she turned her gaze to the rest of the family, her eyes filled with a sad wisdom. "A family is like an old house," she said, her voice a comforting balm in the tense air. "It has many rooms. There is the loud, busy kitchen where everyone talks and makes a racket. But there are also the quiet, hidden rooms, the pantries, the cellars, the attics. These are the places where the real treasures are stored, the things that keep the house standing during the storms. They aren't on display, but without them, everything would fall apart. We forgot to check our quiet rooms." Her words weren't aimed at Richard as an accusation, but as a gentle lesson for them all. Eleanor gently pulled away from her mother's embrace and looked at her brother-in-law. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a deep, abiding sadness. "Richard," she said softly, "I'm sorry. I truly am. I never wanted to shame you. That was not the point of the gift, and it was not the point of telling you." He finally looked up. His face was a mask of utter desolation. The arrogance was gone, the bravado shattered. In its place was something raw and vulnerable, something no one in the family had seen in him for years. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. "No," he managed to say, his voice cracking. Don't you be sorry. I'm the one. He couldn't finish the sentence. He gestured feebly toward the photo album Eleanor was still holding. "Can I?" Eleanor walked over and placed the album on the table in front of him. This time he didn't cast it aside. With trembling hands, he opened it. He turned the pages slowly, one by one. And this time, he saw the picture of his son, face alight with joy, holding up the small fish he'd caught with his grandfather. He saw his wife, Sarah, laughing in the garden, her face carefree for just a moment. He saw a photo of himself, asleep on the sofa after a long day, with the family dog curled up at his feet. He had no memory of the picture being taken. It was a moment of peace he hadn't even known he'd had. He was seeing the wealth he owned but had never counted. His shoulders began to shake as silent sobs racked his body. Sarah went to him, putting a hand on his back, no longer with fear, but with a renewed, albeit fragile sense of partnership. She was comforting the man, not the provider. Arthur cleared his throat, his voice steady and unifying. The night is not over, and Christmas is not ruined. It has just become honest. We are still a family. Let's try to remember how to be one. Later that evening, after the tears had subsided and a fragile peace had settled over the house, Eleanor found Richard standing by the fireplace, staring at the little wooden bird she had carved for her father. He always loved them, Richard said quietly, not turning around. The Finches. He said they were a reminder that the most beautiful things in life are often the most common, and that they're free. He finally turned to face her, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. I have been a fool, Eleanor. A blind, arrogant fool. Thank you for opening my eyes. Eleanor simply nodded, accepting his apology for what it was. A beginning. The greatest gifts, she reflected, are rarely found wrapped in shiny paper under a tree. They are the silent sacrifices, the quiet support, the unseen threads of love that stitch a family together. They are the mortgages paid in secret, the truth spoken with courage, and the grace to forgive. That Christmas, in that warm, pine-scented room, a family was reminded that its true net worth had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with the priceless, immeasurable value of a loving heart. If this story of sacrifice and redemption resonated with you, please consider sharing it with someone who might need a reminder of what truly matters. Sometimes the most powerful acts of love are the ones we never see. Thank you for listening, and may you always find the hidden gifts in your own life, the ones that shine brighter than any store-bought treasure.